What can I say? Where to start? First of all, the main point, if you walk away with anything today, you should realize that we're at one of the most dangerous times in human history for a lot of reasons. I know a lot of folks, of course, understand the weather, the climate change is threatening us, but the other thing that people maybe aren't as aware is the threat of nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia in particular. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which keeps the nuclear clock, the older folks probably remember this, it's a clock that once it hits midnight, we actually have nuclear war. So the closer we get to midnight, the closer we are to the war. And recently, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved the clock from 5 minutes to midnight to 3 minutes to midnight, showing how close we are to nuclear confrontation, the closest we've been in decades. And one thing they looked at to determine this was the fact Obama's decision to spend $1 trillion in modernizing our nuclear weapons stockpile, which Trump is continuing. And the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists concluded that the purpose of that modernization was to give the U.S. first strike capability against Russia. Now, again, for the younger folks in the audience who may not have heard that term before, we used to hear that a lot. A first strike capability would allow the U.S. to attack the Soviet Union, Russia, in the day it was the Soviet Union, to attack Russia with nuclear weapons, overwhelm it, be able to knock out their nuclear weapons, and allow the U.S. to survive. By the way, that would probably lead to the loss of millions of lives, of course in Russia, but also in the U.S. But for years, our military leaders have discussed this possibility, and there are folks in the Pentagon willing to take that risk. I mentioned in here there was some recently declassified documents where they talked about, in the late 60s I believe it was, top military brass talked about the possibility that we might have to lose 20 million people in a confrontation with Russia. And they said that would be okay because we'd still have as many people as we had in the U.S. after the Civil War. Can you imagine the callousness of this? But that shows how dangerous this is. And, you know, for decades, there was at least a consensus amongst the American people that we would not want such a thing. That it was not only wrong, but too dangerous, right? But I just saw a few days ago, there was a new MIT survey. And they asked the following question. Would you be willing for the U.S. to use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear state like Iran, even if it meant killing 2 million Iranians, if it would save the lives of 20,000 U.S. soldiers who wouldn't have to go there and fight? 60% of Americans, 60, said yes, they would support such an operation. And that's where we're at in this country. And the only way you get there is to put people in fear of other peoples. And of course, the flavor of the month, the devil of the month, is Russia and Putin. And, you know, and I say in my book, and I'll say now, you know, I don't, you know, I'm not trying to convince you that Putin's a great guy or anything. But what I would like you to at least think about, regardless of your view of Vladimir Putin, we need to back off this confrontation with Russia for the sake of humanity. And part of doing that is having a more logical and fact-based discussion about our role in the world and Russia's role in the world. And I think if we do that, and I try to do that in my book, I think you'll conclude that Russia is not a threat to the United States. It is not a threat to the West, and that in fact the U.S. is much more of a threat to the world than Russia is. In fact, a recent poll of people from 60 different countries showed that 25% of the world thinks the U.S. is the greatest threat to world peace. Russia didn't even make the top 5. And I think that is where we need to start the discussion. A lot of what we say about Putin could be said about ourselves or about our own country times 10, right? So one thing you only hear people say, well, what about Putin in Ukraine? What about Putin in Syria? And I'll get to those issues. But one thing to think about is, what about the U.S. in Iraq, Somalia, Libya, Afghanistan, Yemen, where 7 million people will die, they're going to die due to starvation, due to the Saudi war on Yemen that the U.S. is supporting right now. And yet it's Putin that's a madman, not Trump and not Obama, who began supporting that war in Yemen, that will have holocaustal numbers of people die. And I think what you see is a way to deflect blame by blaming others, again, for what in fact their own country does. In the same way that, I mean, honestly, Hillary Clinton has done in terms of her campaign loss. Instead of taking stock in herself and her own campaign, she's blamed Russia, and now she's blaming Bernie in her new book. And even if, you happen to be a Hillary supporter, that isn't, that's not taking responsibility for one's own shortcomings. But when it comes to the idea of blaming another country like Russia, and leading people to believe that they have committed the crime of the century, and some people are saying that Russia's alleged interference in the U.S. elections is the crime of the century. I mean, imagine. I mean, I don't know what century they're thinking about. I don't know when they begin that 100 years or end. But if you go back 100 years from today, you had the Holocaust, for one. You had the U.S. war in Vietnam. You had a lot of things happen. And yet this is the crime of the century? But people believe it. And there are Congress people saying that we need a military response to this. And so let's get into that. What is even being alleged against Russia? Is John Pilger, a great journalist who I really respect, said there's not even any allegations. I mean, most of what is supposed to connect the dots on this Russiagate add up to zero. And I'll just give a few examples. One of the latest smoking guns, allegedly, that the New York Times did 2 stories on, was focused on a character named Felix Sater, a Russian national who had some real estate acumen and went to the Trump campaign and said, I can prevail upon Putin to get your hotel built in Moscow, and also Putin will make, he'll put you in the White House. And of course the New York Times in the headline was like, hey, here's the smoking gun, here's the collusion. But if you read into the story, what do you find out? First of all, that hotel was never built. And 2, even according to Sater's emails that they looked at, he said any attempt to ask Putin to assist, to put Trump in the presidency, ended at the end of 2015, when Trump's campaign began in earnest. In other words, nothing happened. Putin either didn't want to or couldn't help Trump even build a hotel there. And Bloomberg, in fact, recently did a story on how poorly Trump's business forays into Russia have always worked out. They never work out. Again, Putin can't even help him with that. And yet, he's now said to put him in the White House. Similarly, another piece of the Russiagate puzzle was that Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, during the transition period, that is after Trump was elected, but before he was sworn in, went to the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, and suggested setting up a back channel to Moscow between the Trump administration and Moscow that would not allow the CIA to be able to listen in on their conversation. Now, first of all, many diplomats, former diplomats, says, well, you know, there's always been a backdoor to Russia because it's a nuclear state. We need to pick up that red hotline and call them in order to maybe prevent a nuclear war. But the other aspect of the story, again, if you read down, according to the Washington Post, Kislyak's reaction to this suggestion by Kushner was he was alarmed. According to the Washington Post, he called his bosses in Moscow and nothing became of the idea. Again, whatever Kushner wanted to do, the Russians didn't want to go along. Same thing with the Trump Jr. meeting with this Russian lawyer. This was supposed to be a big deal. First of all, it's not clear she was even working for the Russian government. But again, whatever Trump Jr. hoped to get out of the meeting, the end of the story was he got nothing. And this is over and over again. Of course, the font of the Russiagate scandal is the allegation that Russia hacked the DNC computers, and much to everyone's chagrin, they spread the truth about how corrupt the Democratic Party was in helping derail Bernie's campaign. First of all, I'll just, as you can tell by my sarcasm, if the Russians did do that, I applaud them. I'm sorry, I'm not upset about that. And certainly it's pretty small potatoes, especially compared to how the U.S. has interfered in other countries' elections. But even beyond that, we have been presented yet with solid evidence that the Russians hacked it. And why is that? Because the DNC never even turned over their computer to the FBI. Instead, they had a private company crowdsource, analyze the computer, and give their opinion and give their conclusions to the intelligence agencies, upon which they then base their conclusions about who hacked or leaked that information. The Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, a group of retired intelligence analysts who worked for the CIA, the NSA, they put out a report saying they actually believe, from what they know, and again, we don't know everything, that the computer information was leaked, meaning someone went to that computer with a flash drive and took the information off, and that it wasn't hacked remotely by Russia or anyone else. Whether we'll know for sure what that was, I don't know, because again, we may never get all that information. I don't know where that computer is today. Maybe it's floating in the East River for all I know. But this is the sum total of Russiagate. This is the crime of the century. And it ain't much of a crime. But meanwhile, this is having very real repercussions. As you know, here in San Francisco, Trump, the pawn of Putin, allegedly, forced the Russians to shut down the oldest consulate they had in the United States here in San Francisco. They then sent FBI agents into the consulate to root around in violation of the Vienna Conventions of 1961, which the U.S. is a party to. According to the Vienna Conventions, which nearly, I think, as far as I know, every country has signed on to, a foreign country's mission, property, their consulates, their embassies are inviolable. Meaning, even during times of war, the host country cannot enter their premises unless invited to do so, which they were not here. This was an act of war. And I was just told by Steve here that, in fact, at a protest of this action last week, that they saw that the U.S. still had security forces there on the premises, on the property of the Russian Federation. They own that property. So not only is it a violation of international law, it's a violation of their property rights, which is the one thing I thought we did still protect in this country, if nothing else. And so it's a very dangerous situation. Now, again, to address the Putin issue, whatever one thinks about Putin, again, he was the first world leader to call George W. Bush after 9/11, offer condolences, offer to help in the war on terror. He did give that help in Afghanistan. He helped Obama negotiate the nuclear deal with Iran. You remember when there was at least alleged chemical attack in Syria, and Obama was being goaded into bombing Syria. Putin bailed him out by saying, you know what, I'll just get Assad to get rid of all the chemical weapons. And that happened. And then in September 2016, Putin worked out a deal with Obama, at least so that they would have an agreement about operations and troop movements in Syria so they wouldn't get in each other's ways and kill each other and maybe lead to a world war. And this was also a hope towards moving towards a bigger peace agreement with Syria. And you remember what happened then? A few days later, the U.S. military bombed a military convoy of Syrians and killed 82 Syrian soldiers, and that was it. That agreement went away. Meanwhile, what was Putin doing over the weekend? While Trump was doing God knows what. I do know Trump left town before he even signed the hurricane relief bill. Putin was busy meeting with the leaders from North and South Korea, trying to prevent a nuclear war on the Korean Peninsula. This doesn't sound like the madman we're led to believe. In fact, I will go out on a limb and say he tends to be the grown-up in the room on a lot of these issues. But yet the craziness continues. You know, you might have seen with Charlottesville, after the Charlottesville protests, Nazi protests and anti-protests, there are folks saying that Putin was behind these protests. Some said aside. Which is not just an insult to Russia, it's an insult to history, you know. The Russians or the Soviets, 74% were in the Soviet army were Russians, lost 27 million people defeating Hitler. They, in fact, won the war in Europe, in all fairness, though that history is being rewritten. Meanwhile, in the fall of last year, Russia proposed an anti-Nazi resolution at the UN, and the U.S. voted against it, with Obama saying that he wouldn't vote for it because Russia's using, anti-Nazism to advance its geopolitical interests. Of course, what's really happening is that the U.S. has been for decades and continues to fund neo-Nazis in the Ukraine. Although, of course, as the former president of Uruguay, the guy who they call the poorest president in the world, he lived in a hut, he said, no, they're not neo-Nazis, they're Nazis. They trace their roots back to the 40s, and even beyond that. And yet we hear very little about that. I just read yesterday that the government in Kiev, Ukraine, has outlawed Russian being taught in the schools. And the folks that they're working with, again, they do work with neo-Nazis or Nazis in Ukraine, have openly called for the eradication of Russians in Ukraine. And so to put the Ukraine crisis all at Putin's feet is not particularly fair. And I would say the same about Syria. You know, one of the things so where did things go wrong between the U.S. and Putin after, again, you might recall that George W. Bush said, I looked into Putin's eyes and I saw his soul, right? And we were friends. And, but then Putin did some things that made him unreliable. He wouldn't support the U.S. invasion of Iraq based on the claim of weapons of mass destruction, because he said everyone knows there are no weapons of mass destruction. Again, he happened to be right. But that's what led to his falling out with Bush. And then in 2011, when the Russian president was Dmitry Medvedev, Obama said he wanted to have a reset of relations with Russia. But then what happened? The U.S. and Western countries, Italy, France, proposed a resolution before the Security Council to have a no-fly zone over Libya. And Russia and China went along. They abstained from the resolution on the promise it wouldn't lead to regime change. And of course, very quickly, the regime was changed. And Muammar Gaddafi, the leader of Libya, was sodomized and murdered on camera. And it's interesting, the madman Putin, when he saw the video of Gaddafi being killed, said it was repulsive. When Hillary Clinton was told that Gaddafi was killed, and this is on YouTube, she cackles and laughs and says, "We came, we saw, he died." And as a result of him dying and Libya being thrown into chaos by our foray into Libya, there are now slaves being sold in public markets in Libya. That is a fact. And so what happened was, at this point, Putin, who becomes president again in 2012, decides fairly reasonably that the U.S. is not a particularly trustworthy partner. And he does decide, and he's invited by Assad to enter the Syrian conflict, and he does, believing that he will not let another Libya happen. Which, again, whether you agree with that decision or not, it's legal because he was asked to by Assad, but also, given what he saw in Libya, there at least was some rationality behind it. In talking about broken promises, you know, at the end of the Cold War, or as it was ending, Gorbachev agreed to the reunification of Germany, which was a big concession given that they lost 27 million people in World War II. But the promise that he was given by Secretary of State James Baker was that NATO would never move 1 inch east of Germany. And very quickly, of course, NATO has been brought to the Russian frontier. And the U.S. just put Patriot missiles in the Baltics for the first time ever. But again, it's Russia somehow that is threatening us. In fact, it's so strange. You'll hear people, you'll read it in the newspaper, people saying Russia is threatening NATO by troop movements on its own border. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if the Russians had troops on the Mexican-American border, and then Russia saying the U.S. is threatening Russia because of troop movements in Texas? This is an absurdity. It would never happen. It's so absurd. And yet we do make that contention. What's really going on is that the U.S., or at least those in the U.S. who govern this country, have decided there can be no country in the world that can compete with the U.S. militarily or economically, even at their own borders, or even within their own borders. And the U.S. has made a point over and over again to show that it can go into another country's borders at will without going through the Security Council, which is required by the UN Charter, and bomb a country into oblivion whenever it wants to. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya are examples. The Physicians for Professional Responsibility, very respected group, recently concluded that the U.S. wars in the Middle East, beginning in 1991 with the war in Iraq, have killed 4 million Muslims. 4 million. And again, yet Russia is the crazy one. What I would say is that we need to focus on our own country's problems and shortcomings, which are ample, and not be worried about what other people are doing. You know, curiously right now, very liberal senators, Elizabeth Warren and Al Franken, are proposing a bill called the Eli Wiesel Anti-Genocide Bill, which would make it easier for the U.S. military to invade other countries to stop genocide, which on its face sounds nice. But if you want to stop genocide, let's start at home and just get the U.S. to not commit genocide other places. I mean, that's actually the best thing we could do as Americans. But it shows the level of ideologization of even liberals and progressives and well-intentioned people who have been led to believe the unbelievable, that the 82nd Airborne is a human rights organization. But people believe that. And yet every country touched by our humanitarian intervention is a lot worse off. I would say, if I were a country in trouble, please, U.S., do not save us. It's the worst thing could ever happen to you. And that's just a fact. Over and over again, our invasions that were meant to bring democracy invariably bring chaos. And yet we say, oh, you know, there's such a, though, inherent belief, and it's a religion. It's a bad religion. It's called American exceptionalism. There is such a belief in the unique goodness of the U.S. that even if over and over again we destroy countries and destroy lives, we're still basically good, right? When other people do wrong, it's because they're inherently bad and they're led by bad intentions. When we do it, it's just because, oops, we're the big giant who stepped on, you know, 1 million people here and 1 million people here, but we didn't mean to do any harm. But you know, when you do it time and time again, and you see that pattern, you realize there's some intention behind it, right? If you come to my house and you break one of my coffee cups, that's fine. Obviously that's a mistake and no problem, but you break 2 or 3 or 4 or 100, I'm thinking now you just want to destroy all my good china. And I think we have to reach that conclusion when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. And so, in conclusion, and I'll be glad to take questions, comments, you know, the reason I wrote this book, and again, I've taken a lot of flack from it, particularly from my friends, you know, who tend to be on the kind of liberal left side of the spectrum and who decided Putin is the worst thing, you know, that ever, since Hitler. But I wrote it because I think fighting the Russia bashing is a necessary precondition to building a peace movement in this country. We need to stop vilifying other countries, the Russias, the Irans, which I visited earlier this year, be happy to talk about, North Korea, etc. And we need to think about how we impact the world and how the world views us and try to set things right here. And I think the way to do that is to rebuild a peace movement in this country, which we've been desperately needing for so long. Question, let me start with the United Nations. I actually teach international human rights law. And what I emphasize is that the UN Charter, all international law since World War II, the UN Charter being really the constitution for international law, the main and chief intent of that document was to prevent wars of aggression. Article 2.4 of the UN Charter forbids force or the use of force. Period. Now, Article 51 says allows for self or collective self-defense in the case of an imminent armed attack. And even then, you have to go to the Security Council after you've prevented that armed attack to do anything further. None of these wars that we're talking about in Iraq or Afghanistan or Yugoslavia or Libya or Somalia were done because of a threat of armed attack by anybody. And so this was violated the most basic precept of the UN Charter, which was created after World War II to prevent another World War II. And as the architects of the UN Charter realized, everything the terrible things the Nazis did, including the Holocaust, all flowed from the initial evil of aggressive war. They could not have created the death camps in countries like Poland if they hadn't invaded Poland to begin with. And so they were going to protect national sovereignty, the architects of the UN Charter, and protect human rights by protecting the sovereignty of states from invasion like that of the Nazis. And yet now it's all been turned on its head. The U.S., again, very, very intentionally over time has whittled away at that and has engaged in wars like the one in Yugoslavia in 1999, where they bombed the former Yugoslavia for, 72 days, without even going to the Security Council. And in 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq, even though they would never have gotten a vote from the Security Council for that war. And so, yes, I think appealing to the UN Charter itself and to international law is a great place to start, and to argue that we need to go back to a rule of law in the world. And of course, you know, the U.S. believes in the rule of law, they just believe it applies to everyone else but us. Right? They're always talking about needing to take this or that leader to the International Criminal Court, for example, but the U.S. isn't even a part of the International Criminal Court because they don't want to be subject to it. Meanwhile, the International Criminal Court, you realize they've only ever prosecuted people from Africa. Only black people go to the International Criminal Court. That's the truth. The law, and I say this obviously sarcastically, but in the end, the U.S.'s view is that international law is for suckers. It's for the weak. It's not for the strong. In fact, that is who it should apply to. The weak need international law to protect them from the strong. That is what the law is for. But the U.S. has whittled away so that it's the mightiest that rule, and the U.S., of course, is the mightiest military power on earth. Now, how can we build the peace movement? I think, we were talking about this before my presentation. I think a key beginning is that wars and the military expenditures are destroying our country. We have spent trillions of dollars, trillions, on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan alone. This year, Congress gave Trump more money for the military than he even asked for. 60% of Democrats voting for it. About $700 billion, which is almost more than all countries combined. Meanwhile, the crazy man Putin just proposed a 25% decrease in military spending. You cannot spend trillions of dollars on war and expect to get your roads built, your levees solidified, and children fed, and health care maintained. You can't have them both. And when you are sending men and women to fight these wars and they come back crippled both physically and mentally, that undermines this country as well. And I think that's how we begin the discussion. You know, Bernie Sanders right now is the most popular politician in America, which is great, because he talks about the need for universal health care, and he talks about the need for jobs and these other things which are great for America. But the one thing he doesn't talk about is the need to ratchet down the military so we can do those things. And that's what we need to be calling on. That is, I think, the best thing you can do. By the way, even if you're an environmentalist, this is the best thing you can do. Do you know the U.S. military, with its 1,000 bases in the world, creates more carbon than the U.S. economy? So when you hear how much carbon footprint the U.S. has, you have to more than double it, because we don't count the military's carbon footprint. I think folks have to get real about that, but it's the one thing there's consensus on. That's the crazy part. The one thing that appears there to be consensus on in this country is that war's good. The one bump Trump got in his approval ratings was when he fired 59 Tomahawk missiles at $1 million apiece into Syria. Then he was acting presidential. That's how you consummate your presidency, your first bombing, right? And we need to rethink that and rethink who we are as a people. And I think, again, folks in this room, could be part of that process, I hope. I mean, the whole idea that the superpowers pretty much agreed on was mad, mutually assured destruction. And they hoped that would prevent a nuclear war, and in the end it did. And then, of course, we moved towards all sorts of treaties, like SALT and the ABM Treaty, to start getting rid of nuclear weapons. And again, as you say, that consensus is broken down. I don't know when exactly that happened, but I think, again, certainly Reagan seemed to want that first strike with the Star Wars program, and again, Obama with this $1 trillion being spent on our weaponry. But one of the things, in fact, that baffled Russia and Putin was that right after, Russia helped with the Afghan invasion after 9/11, Bush backed out of the ABM treaty, much to Russia's chagrin and inexplicably, And it seems to me that it's Russia that's always holding out the olive branch here and us smacking it down, But you're right. I mean, the whole system was built on the idea that we could never go to war because there'd be this mutual annihilation. And I do think the U.S. has decided that they want to go for broke and have the ability to have a nuclear war. I think the chances of the U.S. using a nuclear weapon somewhere are really growing. I think all of this is about imperialism. In fact, the architect of the first Cold War was George Kennan, and he talked about, he said, look, after World War II, the U.S. had about 5% of the world's population, but controlled 50% of its wealth. Can you imagine? And he said, we need to maintain that disproportionate share of the world's wealth. And the only way to do that is to give up naive notions of human rights, these are his words, and deal in pure power concepts. I mean, what he was saying, of course, in plain English, is 5% of the world can't control 50% of the world's resources unless we subjugate the rest of the world. I mean, that's just obvious. It's theft. I mean, it's like you can't have a bank robbery without a gun. I mean, it's just that's really what it amounts to. Now, over the years, of course, after World War II, when finally Germany, Japan, China, Russia got back on their feet, it would be impossible for the U.S. to maintain 50% of the world's resources, and yet it did a pretty good job. So today we still have roughly 5-6% of the world's population and control 25% of its resources. And again, the only way to do that is through violence. It's through depriving other countries of their resources and control over their resources. And I think that's what most of these wars are about. But the other thing I just want to say is, but there's a second piece to that too, while the U.S., with its small population, controls 25% of resources, you and I ain't getting a piece of that 25%, right? That's all going to the top. And in fact, part of the military spending is done so that money continues to trickle upwards and not downwards, right? Military is a retrograde form of taxation. You're taxing the poor to pay for the rich, for those who make money off of war, because they don't want to spend money on things that they see as useless, such as health care and jobs and that sort of thing. And so the military spending actually allows them to keep that money out of the poor people's hands. And one thing I'll say about the health care, for example, national health care, everyone knows it'd be cheaper to provide national health care than it would to have this crazy private system. And of course, the private system is being protected to protect private insurance companies, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is because if all of us contributed according to our means for health care for everyone else, it would create a sense of social solidarity. And that's what the ruling class doesn't want. Sure, and I do talk about that in my book because that is very relevant. As you say. So, for example, Hillary Clinton is upset because she says Russia stole the election. Meanwhile, in 2009, according to the hardcover version of her book, Hard Choices, she admits that she solidified the military coup in Honduras in 2009, with the coup government killing gay activists and environmental leaders and human rights leaders. I said in the hardcover version because when she put out the paperback, she took that section out because she was surprised that people thought that kind of hard choice wasn't a good one. But we can go time and time again how the U.S. has intervened in very flagrant ways. Of course, tomorrow is September 11th. And a lot of folks will be honoring the second September 11th in 2001, the bombing of the attack on the World Trade Center. But the first 9/11 happened in Chile in 1973, with the U.S.'s overthrow of a democratically elected government, the oldest constitutional democracy in the Americas, in Chile. The U.S. overthrew Dr. Salvador Allende and supported the rise of a fascist named Augusto Pinochet. And again, time and again, I'd have to spend a lot of time here to talk about that, but the book does detail a lot more of that. Also, the U.S., at least folks from the Bill Clinton campaign, and Bill Clinton himself, were very active in intervening on behalf of Boris Yeltsin's re-election in Russia in 1996, which of course is quite relevant to this discussion. Vietnam, of course, was another country that the U.S. devastated, killed millions of people, dropped Agent Orange, napalm. There are still babies being born with birth defects because of this. And yet the Vietnamese, of course, have forgiven the U.S. for then we're still partners with the Vietnamese. I mean, the amazing thing is, again, we say, because Russia possibly maybe hacked a computer, it's the crime of the century. Meanwhile, we either kill or wound half of Vietnam, and they can work with us, right? The world is much more forgiving of us than we tend to be of them. Now, how do we, as a people, come together? Those are always hard questions, but again, the peace movements that I knew of in the 80s in particular, and in the 90s against Iraq, and in the 60s, there were still fragmented left, but there was a united peace movement for the most part. I mean, you can unite on these core issues, and I do think the issue of peace is something that we can rally around. At least I would like to believe that. By the way, you mentioned, California being admitted as a state. Of course, we stole California from Mexico, and of course, we stole all this land in general, or Europeans did anyway, I don't want to speak for all of us here, from the Native Americans. I saw a funny little news headline. It says, Native American leader considering giving amnesty to the 240 million illegal Europeans in the United States.